Your friendly neighborhood Spider-Man has been featured across a wide array of web-slinging, wall-crawling video games. Between arcade classics and AAA open-world experiences, players have been controlling the webhead on almost every single console and gaming platform since the 80s. Let's swing through the halls of history and take a look at the evolution of Spider-Man video games. Spider-Man for the Atari 2600, 1982. The web crawler's gaming debut was way back in 1982 when the Parker brothers, no affiliation, released a little game called SpiderMan on the Atari 2600. Not only was this the first Spider-Man game, but also the first Marvel Comics character featured in a video game. Spider-Man for the Atari 2600 was basically a reskin of Crazy Climber, another vertical scrolling game featuring a hero scaling the side of a building. However, this game saw players managing their webbing while Spider-Man swung either diagonally or vertically towards their goal. Stop the Green Goblin. Spider-Man's arch-nemesis would throw bombs that players could defuse, order criminals to cut Spidey's webs, and ultimately face off against the web-slinger in a final boss battle. Battle is a bit generous though. Players mainly just keep Spidey away from the Green Goblin while trying to defuse his super bomb. While the gameplay probably doesn't hold up to today's standards, this was a well-received video game debut for both Marvel Comics and their most treasured hero.
Ball silk slinger! Gotta stop the bombs in time. If I don't get you, webhead, my diagnosis will! Holy Hannah! And you're running out of fluid! Is this more action than even...
The Amazing Spider-Man, 1990. The next notable entry is the platformer, The Amazing Spider-Man, released in 1990 for the Commodore 64 and the Amiga. This 2D side-scroller began as a beat-em-up and morphed into an action platformer as the devs realized Spider-Man couldn't just punch enemies and run around like a standard video game protagonist. Spidey needs to swing, shoot webs, and climb. This game ultimately required 256 frames just for the Spider-Man sprite alone. Players could climb up walls and ceilings, as well as fire webs that clung to surfaces or bound enemies in place. There were some light puzzle mechanics sprinkled through like buttons that opened doors in previous rooms. Spidey could even swing across the screen on a web fired at the ceiling. The story saw players on a mission to stop Mysterio and save Mary Jane. The Amazing Spider-Man is notable since the 2D platforming allowed for an immersive Spider-Man experience with webs that actually stuck to ceilings, a mechanic that some later games couldn't even achieve. Spider-Man, Return of the Sinister Six, 1992. As for Spidey's debut on NES, look no further than Spider-Man, Return of the Sinister Six. This game built upon the 2D side-scrolling framework of the previous title in numerous ways. Spidey moves faster and more fluidly, can punch and dodge attacks, and has web projectiles with an ammo counter. This story was more closely inspired by the web-slinger's written material since it draws from a comic running at the same time. The plot saw Spidey face off against each member of the Sinister Six in their own boss battles. Notable gameplay included webs that can attach to surfaces, enabling the player to swing Spidey for maximum height. After a couple more 2D side-scrollers, we find ourselves at the turn of the century and a new direction for Spider-Man in gaming. Spider-Man 2000. Again. The first 3D outing for the webhead, Spider-Man 2000, served as a debut release in what would become a long-term relationship between Marvel Comics and Activision. By utilizing the Tony Hawk Pro Skater game engine, Neversoft developed the first Spider-Man game for PlayStation back in 2000. Players would brawl with crooks, platform 3D levels, and uncover a more engaging plot than previous entries were able to muster. Speaking of plot, the game featured a nuanced story where a doppelganger frames Peter Parker for theft, while Dr. Octopus and Carnage conspire against the wall crawler. The devs actually created their own original Spidey foe in the form of Monster Ock, the result of Carnage possessing Doc Ock, and he serves as the game's final boss. There's even narration from the late Stan Lee, who co-created the wall crawler way back in the 60s. The game was a huge success and was ported to multiple other platforms before seeing 3 subsequent sequels, all ensuring a future for Spider-Man games.
I am defeated!
Spider-Man 2002. With Marvel looking to adapt more properties after the success of the X-Men movie, Sony partnered up with the comics giant to create a Spider-Man motion picture. Activision, riding the success of the previous game, tasked Treyarch with developing a movie tie-in game for the upcoming film. The gameplay was fairly similar to the level-based beat-em-up style of the previous 3D outings. The plot loosely adapted the story of the film, with the Green Goblin returning as the game's primary antagonist. However, this game and the previous 3D outing both failed to implement web-slinging that stuck to tangible objects above the player. Spider-Man would simply swing from webs attached to nothing, breaking a lot of the immersion when the jump to 3D should be doing the opposite. But with a sequel to the hit film on the way, the devs at Treyarch sought to revolutionize their next Spider-Man gaming experience. Spider-Man 2, 2004. With the widespread success of both the film and its respective game, it was a no-brainer for Treyarch and Activision to produce another movie tie-in. Similar to Spider-Man 2002, the plot borrows from the film as Dr. Octopus occupies the main villain role. But rather than just simply improving on the 3D games that came before, the devs wanted to go bigger, and bigger they went. Spider-Man 2 took place in an open-world recreation of New York City, with players now able to walk around on street level, climb up buildings, and swing around the city skyscraper to skyscraper. On the topic of swinging, the magicians at Treyarch finally did it. Swinging in a 3D Spider-Man game no longer meant sticking webs to invisible clouds. In Spider-Man 2, players would fire off webs from each hand, and if no structure stood above them, Spidey plummeted to the city streets. Luckily, other abilities like wall running and the charged jump meant Spidey was back in air in no time, and the player was back to engaging with more amazing web-swinging physics. Ultimate Spider-Man, 2005. Treyarch developed another Spider-Man tie-in to coincide with the final entry in the Raimi trilogy, which carried over a lot of what worked with Spider-Man 2. In 2005, they released yet another Spider-Man open-world game, but this one was completely separate from any movie. Ultimate Spider-Man introduced a new playable protagonist, allowing players to take on the role of both Spider-Man and the anti-hero, Venom. The two protagonists played very differently. Spidey still swung around shooting webs at enemies, but Venom used tentacles and huge leaps for traversal, while also needing to feed on NPCs to stay alive. It's a good thing then that the artists moved away from attempting realism. Instead, they created a comic book adjacent art style that would eventually go on to inspire games like Spider-Man: Shattered Dimensions. Spider-Man: Web of Shadows, 2008. The next notable alteration to the Spidey game formula came with Spider-Man: Web of Shadows. While mostly retaining the swing around an open-world beating-up thugs gameplay loop of the previous 3D titles, Web of Shadows added some crucial new mechanics to the combat that would later be iterated on in modern-day releases. Finally, after 26 years of Spider-Man video games, you can beat up bad guys in the air. Web of Shadows introduced the Web Strike, an ability that sees the wall crawlers zipping to enemies for a heavy hit. Players were no longer stuck to the ground when brawling with henchmen. Spidey could now fight on both walls and in the air. The story was also a fresh new take for the franchise, with big decisions made by the player that altered the story's events. The morality system was also involved in the player's option of suit. The classic red costume provided a straightforward Spider-Man experience, while the black symbiote one leaded into the darker side of Peter Parker. Spider-Man: Shattered Dimensions, 2010. With the new twist on the Spider-Man formula, seeing players control fellow tertiary spider characters like Venom, it was refreshing to see a game where you play as not just 1 or 2 Spider-Man, but 4. Spider-Man Shattered Dimensions kicked off the 2010s with another comic book-inspired art style and a return to level-based brawling gameplay. Players could choose between Amazing Spider-Man, Ultimate Spider-Man, Spider-Man Noir, and Spider-Man 2099. This game apparently inspired the Spider-Verse comic, which then on went to inspire the hit film Into the Spider-Verse. Incredible to see that a game led to a comic, which leads to a film, when the creative pipeline rarely flows this direction.
Uh-oh! Who's about to get pro?
Marvel's Spider-Man 2018. After a bit of a drought for Spider-Man-led video games, Insomniac, developers of Ratchet & Clank, were tasked by Sony to create an all-new, original Spider-Man video game for the PS4 console. Taking in the successful gameplay innovations of the many devs that came before, Insomniac delivered on a critically successful commercial hit with Spider-Man 2018. The web swinging featured a physics-based system, with webs again attaching to structures. Players could easily pick up the controller and get to swinging, but mastering the momentum of navigating New York City required time and effort. The combat also utilized the web strike and aerial innovations from Web of Shadows. The original story featured a lesser-known villain as the main antagonist, Mr. Negative, along with other prominent villains from the Webhead's Rogues Gallery. It also saw players take control of Mary Jane and Miles Morales for stealth sections that were not as unanimously praised as the regular Spidey gameplay, but it would only be a matter of time before Miles joined Peter as a web crawler all his own. Marvel's Spider-Man, Miles Morales. A spin-off title released 2 years later would finally see a new protagonist don the spandex suit. Spider-Man Miles Morales reintegrates much of the same systems from the previous title, but shakes things up in a few key areas. The game takes place during the holiday season, with players zipping around a new snow-covered New York. Miles also has 2 other abilities distinct from Peter: invisibility and Venom. Not Venom as in Venom, the playable anti-hero from Ultimate Spider-Man 05, but as in a sting caused by Miles' electrically charged powers. The game was released alongside the PS5 as a must-play for the 8 people able to acquire the new console in late 2020.
Saw the explosion. Are you okay? I'm fine. But did you see the Tinkerer? Finn.
Marvel's Spider-Man 2, 2023. The second Spider-Man 2 mentioned in this video is set to release almost 20 years after the game sharing its title. The franchise has come a long way since then, and with all the amazing developments and iterations on the Spidey game formula, this title is set to deliver on countless fronts. Little is fully confirmed at the moment, but players do know they'll be able to play as both Spidey protagonists in a story that continued the legacy of Peter and Miles. Kraven has been mentioned alongside the inevitable inclusion of the symbiote. Seeing previous games like Web of Shadows and Ultimate Spider-Man incorporate multiple playable heroes while utilizing the symbiote in gameplay leaves imaginations running wild with possibilities. Will Miles and Peter occupy opposing sides in a morality system? Will you be able to swap characters on the fly, or are the switches more story-oriented? Can we please, for the love of all things, Spidey, leave the Mary Jane stealth sections in the past? We won't have to wait long for the answers, as the next title to join the storied history of Spider-Man games releases later this year.
Yes, we will.
Well, that's a look at the evolution of Spider-Man games. I'm sure there's a few titles that we skipped over, so feel free to shout out your favorite wall crawler gaming experiences down in the comments. Remember to like and subscribe, and have a fantastic day!